Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Make sure that you let us know where you're coming from in the chat. We're excited to have you with us tonight. Um, go ahead and tell us where you are. Hello, Napa, California, and Milwaukee, Des Moines, Oside. Hey. All right. We have a really great conversation tonight. We're excited to have you join us for it. We do have some kind of community standards, so we're going to ask you to play nice. Use your nice words in the chat. Trolling behavior will not be tolerated. We are heavy-handed with the band hammer. Tonight's session is a webinar, but we do invite your questions. So make sure that if you have questions tonight, add them to the chat and we will be answering them as we can. The questions will be saved for the end of the conversation, but we will try to answer as many of them as we can tonight. If a lot of people have the same question, we're just going to pick someone's arbitrarily to answer that one. So make sure that you let us know where you're coming from in the chat. We're excited to have you with us tonight. If you need closed captioning, please join us on Facebook. Facebook does have closed captioning available. Unfortunately, YouTube has not caught up to that yet for live streams. So if you need closed captioning, please join us on Facebook. And that link is in the chat for anybody who needs it. So again, make sure that you are letting us know where you're coming from. I see a lot of Californians coming out tonight. My people. We got some Seattle, Fairfax, Virginia. Now, I know that we have some really great activities happening around so many of you this weekend for our Free America weekend, and we'll be sharing more information about that throughout the night, but make sure that you are checking the map to find out where you can be plugging in this weekend for Free America weekend. If you have questions at any point in the session, make sure you ask them in the chat. Again, I'm being repetitive, but I just want to reiterate, we will be going through the chat, keeping an eye on that and watching out for your questions. I will also, again, reiterate, if you are trolling, if you are spamming, if you are sending a little bit too many comments about the same things or unrelated things to our conversation tonight, you will be removed. This is so that we can have a robust conversation. We do want this conversation to be a community conversation. We don't want anybody's, pet issue to override the conversation at hand. So let's make sure that we are not trolling. We're not spamming the comments. We want to hear from you. So let's make sure that we're asking questions that are part of the conversation. All right, so we're going to start getting into it. This is an education call tonight. We are excited to have some really great guests, to have a great panel tonight. This is being recorded and live streamed to YouTube and Facebook. And again, captions are available on Facebook if you need closed captions. My name is Reese Abadias. I'm the digital organizer with Women's March, and we are really excited to offer these study sessions in preparation for Free America Weekend, where we are reclaiming patriotism, because patriotism is thoughtful, it is intention, and it is us examining what it truly means to realize the promise of America. Unlike our mass calls, this will be a conversation between our speakers, working to explore the roots and the legacy of abolitionist organizing in the US. So I'll be watching the chat. I'll be watching the chat for your questions, and I will be introducing you to our moderator for tonight, who is going to facilitate this discussion. And then we'll have some time for Q&A. So like I said, make sure you're asking your questions in the chat, and we will be watching that throughout the night. While these organizations all have ways for you to take action, the purpose of these sessions is for us to be in collective study about where we have been and where we are now so that we can vision together for a free feminist future for all of us. We invite you to listen, to take notes, to discuss, and afterwards to check out the readings that you will receive in your follow-up email. So we'll have an email go out to everybody who registered within 24 hours of this session. We do have some community norms, so please be respectful in the comments. We do have some working agreements, some of them including being respectful toward each other, come from a place of trying to understand, give each other some grace, and assume each other's best intentions. So make sure that you are being kind in the chat. Make sure that you're asking questions, and we will be answering them later on in the session. Don't worry if your question doesn't get answered immediately during the session. We will get to it. We're not trying to put you off. We are trying to get through the conversation as much as we can, and we will get to as many questions as we can. All right. Thank you again for letting us know where you're coming from. And thank you for being part of this conversation tonight. Without any further ado, I am pleased to introduce Tamika Middleton, and I'm going to add her to the stage with me. Hi, Tamika.
Hello, hello, hello. Thank you, Risa. Welcome back, everyone. Thank y'all so much for joining us, especially those of you who also joined us on last Thursday for our study session on war in the time of genocide. It was a really beautiful and generative conversation. If you missed that conversation, please go to our YouTube channel. You can find it there. We're just Women's March on YouTube, or go to our Facebook page. It lives there as well. Again, as Risa said, afterwards, we will have a beautiful study guide with some resources, some links, etc., some readings that we would love for you to engage in to continue to build our politic and our political understanding of the conditions that we're living in right now, but also how we got here. And understanding how we got here and understanding where we are now helps us to better understand what it will take for us to get to the future we envision for ourselves and for each other. So once again, thank y'all so much. Shout out to all of you from wherever you are joining us tonight. I am so excited to get into this conversation. This is I feel like I'm probably most excited. This might be the most excited I've been in any of our calls. Some of the smartest people that I have ever known are going to be in this conversation. And so I just really encourage y'all to listen in, to listen intently, to listen with curiosity. And as Risa named, we are in a space together. We invite and encourage conversation and dialogue and questions. And also, I want to name this very clearly. Risa talked about the trolling, the spamming, the overdoing it in the comments, but also one of my favorite sort of group agreements is oppression exists, but we challenge it here. We are in a space where we are recognizing that everybody doesn't know everything. We all are living in the muck of racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, etc. In this space, we challenge that for ourselves, and we lovingly challenge it with each other, right? While also offering folks a space and encouragement to grow and be better. So with that, welcome to our second Free America Study Session. In these study sessions, our invitation is to grapple with this question of what is the promise of America as we enter into the 4th of July weekend. What is the promise of the Declaration of Independence? What are the principles that as a country, that this country has espoused, and the flags that we wave across the world? And how are we actually living into that? And what have been the points historically that have been inflection points, that have been moments where this country has been at a crossroads around how to lean into the concepts that supposedly undergird our freedoms, our collective identity, right? Our national identity. And when we have not chosen correctly, how do we grapple with that? How are we honest about that? How do we undo and actually, dismantle this sort of collective historical amnesia about the realities of the country so that we can truly step into a new vision? And so today, our topic is we're talking about abolition. And we're going to get into a little video first that gives a little bit about what abolition is, and then I'll introduce our speakers and we'll get into more of the discussion. I see someone saying you cannot find last week's recording. Heard, understood. We will make sure that we link it in the resources. But by the end of the show, somebody will find it and link it here for us, okay? All right, and with that, I'm going to share this video.
So imagine how we felt after September 11th.
The United States claims to be the land of the free, founded on the principles of freedom, liberty, democracy, and equality for all. If that is true, why are there so many people behind bars? We comprise less than 5% of the world's population, but we have 25% of the world's prisoners. More prisoners per capita than any other nation. The United States has been described as a prison nation and the birthplace of the prison industrial complex. With $100 billion spent annually on police and over $60 billion spent on prisons, are we really creating a safer and better society for all? What is the history behind this prison nation and the prison industrial complex? Does the United States create more criminals than any other nation on the planet? Or is there another agenda at work? We explore these questions by examining the history and policies that have fueled the growth of the prison industrial complex. Our film focuses on how the prison system has affected women in our communities and what they are doing to create better alternatives.
Critical Resistance is a group whose mission it is to stop the prison industrial complex, and to really challenge this whole idea that it's more prisons and more policing and more surveillance that's what's going to make our communities safer. We don't think that's what we need for better safety.
This documentary grew out of the LEAD project, which is a partnership between Critical Resistance and A New Way of Life. A New Way of Life provides transition homes for women coming home from prison and women on parole in South Los Angeles. By focusing on how women are affected by the prison industrial complex and what women are doing to create life-sustaining alternatives, we want to expand our understanding of prisons and their abolition as a vision and a path to a better future.
Realize I'm muted. Sorry. All right. I wanted to open us up with just a very light touch on what we're going to be talking about today, sort of an introduction. Sorry. Just sort of a light touch on what we're going to be in today, what we're going to be discussing, and we'll share the link to the website for that film. I don't know if it's still available. It's some years old, but we'll definitely drop the link to that video, and there'll also be some additional videos in the study guide materials. But without further ado, I want to go ahead and jump into the conversation. So I'm going to introduce us to our speakers, and I'm actually going to read the bios of all three of our speakers, although one of our speakers is not here yet, but will be joining us before we close. But these two speakers, I just, am so excited about, because I have known them for a very long time, since I was a baby organizer, and they have been super instrumental in shaping who I am as an organizer. And so I owe a lot to them and to their wisdom. So I'm very excited to bring them out. So the first I'm going to introduce is Kenyon Farrow. Kenyon Farrow is an award-winning Black gay writer, activist, and strategist who has spent the last 20 years working in social movements on campaigns and projects, large and small, community-based, national, and global in scope. He has trained and mentored scores of organizers, myself being one, helped shape local, state, and national policy, and his writing has shaped entire debates of national importance on everything from criminal justice issues, housing and urban policy, HIV and public health, and popular culture. Kenyon is the director of communications, where he leads AVAC's communication team, as well as narrative change and strategic communications efforts to help influence key stakeholders, policymakers, and the media to expand access to HIV prevention, supporting R&D and programs, and advancing global health equity. I want to read this part. Kenyon is most known for his work as a former executive director of Queers for Economic Justice, where he worked on LGBT housing and homelessness issues in NYC and helped push for more attention to issues impacting poor LGBT people, while the marriage equality movement sought to ignore. He's also worked as an organizer and communication strategist for groups like Critical Resistance, Housing, and Fierce and Housing Works. So y'all, please welcome Kenyon Farrow. And then our second speaker, who I will introduce, is Andrea Ritchie. Andrea Ritchie is a Black lesbian immigrant survivor who has been documenting, organizing, advocating, litigating, and agitating around policing and criminalization of Black women, girls, trans, and gender nonconforming people for the past 3 decades. She has been actively engaged in anti-violence, labor, and LGBTQ organizing, and in movements against state violence and for racial, reproductive, economic, environmental, and gender justice in the U.S., Canada, and internationally since the 1980s. Andrea is the author of Invisible No More, Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color, and the co-author of No More Police, A Case for Abolition, Say Her Name, Resisting Police Brutality Against Black Women, and of Queer Injustice, the Criminalization of LGBT People in the United States. She co-founded Interrupting Criminalization and the In Our Names Network, a network of over 20 organizations working to end police violence against Black women, girls, trans, and gender nonconforming people, and led Insight's work on law enforcement and violence. So everybody, please show love to Andrea. Brilliant. And if you joined us last summer, we had In Our Names Network on to talk about Sonia Massey and Sonia Massey's case and supporting kind of getting people out to do vigils in the aftermath of the murder of Sonia Massey. And then our final panelist, who will join us in a few, but I'm going to go ahead and read his bio now, is Dan Berger, who is a professor of comparative ethnic studies at the University of Washington, Bothell, where he directs the Washington Prison History Project, a multimedia archive of local prisoner organizing and prison policy. He is the author or editor of several books, including Captive Nation, Black Prison Organizing in the Civil Rights Era, Rethinking the American Prison Movement, co-editor with Toussaint Louverture, and most recently, State on Freedom, The Long History of Black Power Through One Family's Journey. He is currently writing Prison, A History of the United States, which will be published by Basic Books. His articles have appeared in Boston Review, Inquest, and Truth Out, among elsewhere. Prior to moving to Seattle, he co-founded the organization Decarcerate PA. So y'all, I know there's a lot. Very accomplished guests today. I'm so grateful. First and foremost, thank y'all for being here. I'm so excited. Okay. Starting simple. In y'all's words, can you define abolition? What is abolition?
Andrea. All right, fine. I was like, but I learned it from y'all. So what are you talking about? But okay. I just want to lift up that Tamika Middleton has been a teacher of mine since we first met many years ago in New Orleans at Critical Resistance South, organized by the organization that made that video, and that, you know, Kenyon also has been a teacher of mine through Critical Resistance and Queers for Economic Justice. So I'm just grateful and want y'all to know that Tamika is a source of this politic as well. But for me, I mean, abolition is both a vision and a practice of a world without violence of any kind, including the violence and especially the violence of surveillance, policing, imprisonment, detention, deportation, exile, and a place in which all of our needs are met without condition, and in which all of us have the capacity and the opportunity to live into our fullest human potential and to experience the fullest love, joy, and beauty and human experience that the world has to offer. And that is, as I say, a vision and a practice that we can practice every single day, but also a horizon that we're always moving towards. So it's not a place that we're going to get to one day, the promised land. It's one that we're going to keep rebuilding and keep reimagining and keep practicing together every day. And it's possible to see it in action already. Abolition is already in existence in the world, and also is the vision that we need to keep aiming towards as we're fighting all the forms of violence that we're living through in the present.
I don't have much to say beyond that. That's a great answer. I would just probably just reiterate the point. I think for me, abolition is usually related to kind of transforming systems of power where domination is involved, and and kind of dismantling those kinds of systems, and which usually emanate from the state, but they also play out in cultural and social ways, but ultimately it's about dismantling those structures that impede freedom, period.
Absolutely. One of the things, like, I remember years ago first reading, people talking about, like you were saying, Kenyon, dismantling systems of oppression, but the only way you do that is by getting to the root, right? What are the root causes? Where does this come from? And especially being from the South, of course, we're talking about generations and generations and generations, going all the way back to enslavement. And so one of the things we've been talking about and thinking about, really to ground this session, is looking at historical abolitionists, and in particular looking at Frederick Douglass. And as we were sort of promoting the promo for this, if people were on our Instagram and on our Facebook, you saw us quoting Frederick Douglass. He said, gives this speech July 5th, 1852, and he says, fellow citizens, pardon me, allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I, therefore, called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us? And so that's one of the things I really have been grounding in as we've been building these sessions, is that speech that we refer to now as "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." And so I felt like, in particular, it felt relevant for this conversation. And I would love to sort of grapple with that question. Here we are, 173 years after Frederick Douglass gave that speech, and there are around 2 million people in this country in correctional facilities and more than 5 million under state supervision. And I would love to hear how you all reflect on the 4th of July and what it represents as modern day abolitionists. And I know Andrea was like, I got to answer too now. So, but either one of y'all can start, and also feel free to bounce off of each other.
I was going to take this one first, since I kind of
go for it, Kenyon, please.
No, I think the way I think about it is really a reflection of, or to sort of paraphrase a lot of James Baldwin's thinking about the United States. And a lot of what Baldwin's work was about the lie that white Americans have to tell themselves in order to stand this up, right? And to believe in the myth of it, right? And he also talked a lot about how infantile the United States was for its inability to really actually honestly and truthfully deal with its history and its present moment, for that matter, right? And you can't. That's part of the dynamic, the present moment. Even today, right, and the things that we're obviously dealing with is so difficult in some respects to deal with, because people don't want to reckon with how we got here, right? And so when I think about Frederick Douglass's speech, I think it's that kind of a similar kind of rhetorical flourish to kind of point to the myth of and the myth of the founding of this country as a fundamental big lie that does not actually resonate in any real way certainly for Black folks, Frederick Douglass's case, slaves and their descendants, immediately thereafter the Civil War. So I think that the speech to me is one of the best, kind of rhetorical examples, in rhetorics and in writing in this country, really kind of getting to the false notion of the founding of this country as some sort of new free space that didn't exist in the world, as opposed to a new collection of people who were oppressed in one place, who stood up another system of domination on another continent based on the things that they were already advancing on the places that they just left.
Yeah, I'm super grateful for that framing, Kenyon. I think part of the reason that that I was hesitant to answer that, both, in all of my identities, right? As a migrant to this space, as a Black woman, as a queer person, was that it just does, that America, the US, as it has been articulated, has never felt like a political project that I'm part of, right? I'm remembered of kind of the follow-up speech or a follow-up speech, that Malcolm X gave, that is memorialized in the beginning of the film X, which I would say is one of the best film beginnings I've ever seen, where it ends like, I didn't land on Plymouth Rock landed on us, right? And that is true for people who don't even live inside the borders of the United States, right? And that's my experience as someone growing up in a neighbor to the north and a neighbor to the south, where the US lands on us as a both a political project that projects these ideals that it holds other spaces up to, while enacting the mirror image opposite of those ideals, both within its borders and outside them. So it really feels like it's a political project that from Frederick Douglass to Malcolm X to Sojourner Truth to Harriet Tubman to all of us on this call, lands on us, but that we are not reflected in. And we're seeing that in Technicolor right now. And so grateful for grounding us in that moment. Yeah.
I want to appreciate y'all for bringing in other thinkers. I've been thinking a lot about the way in thinking about the sort of the texts that we have, especially as Black folks, and for me as a Black Southerner, that like, if we put in conversation with the sort of kind of patriotic texts that, that are sort of foundational to the history we learn in this country, that people of color, poor folks have always had this, have always been creating things that actually, if we put them into conversation, create a more full narrative and a more full history. And so much of that text, like so many folks, have not had access to or have not been exposed to James Baldwin. So much, into the provocations that he offers, and so many, and then there are so many provocations, right? Like I was thinking just about Lift Every Voice and Sing as a provocation in response, in conversation with if we put it in conversation with the Star Spangled Banner, or there's so many things that if we can put in conversation with these texts. And so this one of the things that I appreciate, so I'm just grateful for y'all lifting that up. And then to sort of return to Douglass, one of the things that I also think is interesting is that people, even in the comments leading up to this, like, so, there were some questions like, how does abolition of slavery connect to the abolition that y'all are talking about right now? And I'm like, even Douglass made that connection. Even Douglass, in the late 1800s, after the Civil War, referred to what emerged in the place of enslavement, which was the convict lease system. He referred to it as, quote, a worse slavery than that from which African Americans had been liberated. And so the abolitionist movement continued to sort of grow along this trajectory, and shifted and changed because at no point were there not people in chains, on the soil. And so I would love for y'all to talk about sort of the ways in which the abolitionist movement has shifted and adapted over time. What have y'all seen? Even like, listen, I have been around since the early 2000s, and I've even seen the abolitionist movement shift and change. So I would love to hear, from y'all what y'all have seen as sort of shifts and changes and growth.
Yeah, I think, obviously, as you mentioned, we often, or I think kind of most people think about, abolition in the sense of it's always reference to slavery, right? And chattel slavery in the United States. But the work that a lot of folks, Frederick Douglass and other folks, who came after that were, critiquing both the, growth of the prison system in the United States and its kind of real birth in that period after the end of slavery, as the connection there, and also the connection to the birth of policing, right, in our culture, which also comes out of the same, period and era. And I would also say that, that work. And then even while folks weren't necessarily framing it as abolition, but I think things like the anti-lynching movement that also comes kind of after this is an abolitionist movement, because it's actually dealing with in some cases where the actual police were involved, in a lot of cases were actively involved in a lot of lynching and kind of mass terror of Black people. But then also lynching is also dealing with kind of vigilanteism, the sort of like white skin is deputized, as police itself, right? And so I think of that it's sort of dealing with those things. And then, obviously we get to the civil rights movement, Black liberation movement, where the kind of focus on prisons also becomes, clearer in terms of how people are thinking about, Black struggle. So to me, I see that sort of connection. And then, and then obviously I think, from on as we think about the kind of birth of prison abolition and the kind of frame of the prison industrial complex, where I think, that work at the kind of establishment of critical resistance as an organization in the late 1990s, I think, and begins to really think about not just the jail itself, but the kind of what we would now kind of, I feel like in the last 10 years, we now kind of talk about as like the carceral state, like the different ways in which punishment and kind of policing and surveillance and capture of various sorts are so embedded in so many areas of our society as kind of some of the evolution of that.
Before Andrea responds, I just want to take a moment. I'm just going to bring Dan up on stage because Dan has joined us in the building. So I'm just going to bring him on stage. welcome. And then I'm sorry. I just wanted to go ahead and do that. And then Andrea, you can go ahead and jump in. Sorry.
Oh, sure. You want me to talk about history when the historian just came on? Okay, I'm gonna do my best.
I know.
But I would say that I'll talk about it from a perspective that I know. The through line from the foundation, from the colonization of this land that we're on to now is criminalization. And when I say criminalization, I'm not just talking about enacting and enforcing criminal laws and policies. I'm talking about practices of policing and punishment and exclusion by the state, by institutions, and by individuals in the ways that Kenyon was talking about, who are enacting criminalization in their, who are deputized by the state to criminalize and who deputize themselves to criminalize, right? The militias, who were the first police forces alongside slave patrols and Indian patrols in this country. And so when you think of it that way, criminalization is a political process that creates groups of people who are inherently criminalized as others, right? Indigenous peoples of this land who are inherently criminalized by European colonizers and invaders as heathens, as savages, as morally bankrupt, as whatever projection they wanted to or needed to put on a group of people in order to manufacture consent for and justify colonization, theft of land, genocide of people, in order to establish, to have that Plymouth Rock land on the indigenous peoples of this country, even though Plymouth Rock is their rock, right? And so that process, political process, is enacted to serve existing relations of power or desired relations of power. And once a group of people are criminalized, they are othered in a way for which rights don't exist in reality, because they just are not part of the Declaration of Independence. They're not part of the Constitution. One of the first cases you learn in law school is that indigenous peoples will never find justice in the courts of the conqueror. And they don't say that nuanced. They say that in those words. So it's quite clear that they're saying, once a population is criminalized, we will steal land, commit genocide, enslave, steal labor, steal spirit, steal everything from those people. And we're seeing that playing out live today in Palestine, where we have criminalized an entire population of Palestinians, from newborns to nonagenarians, and everyone is to be eliminated because they're a threat to an existing order that that criminalization is how it's upheld. So I think it's important for us to understand criminalization as that through line. We criminalize indigenous people to steal the land and try and erase the people. We criminalize the entire continent, Black population of Africa, to steal the land, criminalize, steal the people, and create an economy that is built on genocide and chattel slavery. And then once we sort of make a legal change, criminalization doesn't end, it just shifts forms. And I think that's an important through line as well, which is why it went so quickly from enslavement to convict leasing. And I think people don't think about that through the lens of gender particularly, which is that when Black women left white houses in droves and stopped performing reproductive labor for people who formerly enslaved them, and instead were like, I'm gonna go do reproductive labor for my own family, kin, or myself, right, as a fully embodied human, white folks were like, no, we need something. We're not doing this reproductive labor. And the convict leasing system was about picking up women who were just outside, Black women who were just outside living their lives. Sometimes they would use children as a way of doing it, be like, oh, your kids are too loud, or your kids are not well clothed because we stole everything from you, whatever, right? And to re-enslave those women and gender nonconforming people back into domestic servitude under the same political conditions, right? And the same systems of power. And then keep them in there by, people who were now leasing their labor from the state being like, oh, you stole my brooch. I just made that up. And the cops will come in and be like, absolutely. And now you're going to be stuck in servitude again in my house. So we really have to understand criminalization as kind of the root of this country, and the route on which we have to pull in order to eliminate all the ways in which it's manifesting through all the institutions that we see it manifesting right now, in its most extreme form as an authoritarian, like as a way that authoritarianism and fascism are happening. Like criminalization in authoritarianism and fascism isn't just how the authoritarians repress their enemies, right? Or push back resistance. Criminalization under authoritarianism and fascism is how they do the thing. It's literally how it happens. You, again, create a population, migrants, trans people, pregnant people, abortion seekers, people who want access to a workplace, access to an education institution, as the threat to the social order that you imagine, desire, exists, and then you make them the enemy. And then you ratchet it up to a point where it's like these people must be eliminated, exterminated, expelled. And that's where we are in this moment, but it's a clear through line from that 1492 beginning to 2025 now, that we need to address if we're actually going to effectively fight fascism. The best chance we have of doing that is by striking at criminalization, which is at the heart of authoritarianism and fascism. And that is actually where we begin the process of building an abolitionist future in this country. But maybe Dan has other ideas.
Dan, welcome. You can jump in on this question about the sort of trajectory of abolitionists, how abolitionists organizing over time, over generations. And also, I'm gonna, because you came right on time, because I have another question that I would love for you to jump in on too, which is also, especially, and Andrea did my segue for me. I appreciate that. Into talking about fascism, but especially in talking about what is the strategy that we need to be addressing and thinking about under fascism. And one of the things that really came up for us as we were sort of formulating this session was about the lessons that we can learn about how to organize under fascism from folks who are locked up. And so I would love for either question, jump in as you please.
Wow, thank you. It's really nice to be here with all of you. Sorry for being late, but I'm glad I'm right on time. So, this is all really, really important conversation, and I am in the middle of working on a book that is basically an incarcerated people's history of the U.S., starting from before the U.S. was a thing. And so I wanted to just say a little bit on the history question, but I'm gonna restrain myself from going too deep into it. But I think the points that Kenyon and Andrea were making are so important. And if you go back to the colonial charters from England, from France, from Spain, when they were sending people to colonize what is now the United States, part of the directives were set up a jail, set up a prison, right? That it is built into the colonial infrastructure, both criminalization as a kind of political ideological apparatus in the way that Andrea was laying out, but also the prison as an institution in the way that Kenyon was laying out, right? That these are direct material institutions from the beginning, right? And I sort of began that project with trying to think about, well, what is the first prison? Like, can we say is like the first American prison? But it's there all over, right? Like it's in all of these colonial charters from Europe, from different European countries. It's obviously in the slave ship and the slave dungeons and that Europeans built in Western Africa to transport people to this country, right? And so I think from the beginning we have an industrial system, right? A kind of institutional system that is dedicated to confinement, captivity, coerced labor, that is also global from the outset, right? And so I think when we're talking about Palestine and US imperialism in this moment, as we all should be, I think we can see the prison as kind of that initial seedbed of an institution that helped give rise to the United States, right? Through these kind of imperial circuits. And I think that sense of what it means to resist, authoritarianism and fascism, but also to resist the kind of repression of liberal democracy, which defines a lot of the U.S. experiment in ways that we should not be naive about what that means, right? Right? And the extreme authoritarianism and often genocidal racism of even liberal democracy as the U.S. has understood it. And so one thing that's been striking to me in this research is seeing how many people, going back generations, not just in the last, our living history for those of us on this call, but going back generations, people understood what the prison was as an institution, right? And that many of the defining features of what we now call mass incarceration in terms of solitary confinement, arbitrary and capricious violence, censorship, prisons as breeding grounds of disease and people exposing people to premature death, all of that is there in the institution from the very beginning, right? And so this is where I think incarcerated people and studying the traditions of incarcerated people are so helpful in thinking about this particular moment, right? And I think that there's a lot of I think we have to approach it sort of dialectically, right? Which is to say, it's not romanticizing what people have done or are doing on the inside to say that's perfect and we just need to do that. Like those are hard fought lessons learned under abysmal conditions that nobody should be in, right? and there's a lot of grief and mistakes and trauma that accompanies all of that organizing, right? And so I think it's both important to look to that history, but also to look to it in a way that is, highly, sensitive to and appreciative of the tremendous sacrifices that come within that, right? There's a lot there, and I don't want to talk for too long uninterrupted, right? But I guess, right, one thing that I think is fundamental to that inside organizing is that it's never just in one place, right? That connections between inside and outside are often fundamental. That there are people who are very sophisticated, dedicated, experienced organizers alongside people who are showing up in the moment, right? Right, and that people are often called to meet a moment, right, when there is a riot, an attack, or some other kind of incident inside, right, in this kind of repressive situation. And so part of what I think that tells us, right, is that there's a lot that we should always be planning for and strategizing around, and what moves things forward are often things that we can't anticipate, right? So I always think it's important to talk with people about 2020, and so much of the repression that we're living through right now is trying to make the uprisings of 2020 unthinkable and impossible, right? The very first expressions of uprising in 2020 were in prisons and jails and detention centers. Before George Floyd was murdered, it was people who did not want to die from a pandemic that they saw was coming to kill them because the institution had no concern. None of us knew the extent of it, but anyone who was paying attention, anyone who knew what carceral systems were like, knew that people inside of them were going to be sacrificed and rendered disposable. And so there were hundreds of different kinds of uprisings inside jails, prisons, and detention centers, right? Some people who were involved in them, I'm sure, had a kind of broader politic and broader analysis of the world. Many of them just knew what was going to happen and did not want to die, right? And so I think that sense of, on the one hand, planning ahead and being strategic and organizing for the long haul, while at the same time being open to that sense of the unexpected and the improbable, and knowing that there are, our job as organizers, I think, is often to kind of create the containers that allow people to step in to kind of meet the moment. And when that happens, what those people will do will far outpace anything that the organizers have prepared for them. So there's a lot more to say about that, but maybe I'll stop there before I get going.
I appreciate that. I appreciate on both questions. And one of the things that came up for me when you were talking about sort of the prisons as sort of as the seedbed is 20 years ago in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, Burl Cain, who's in New Orleans, sheriff at that time, what he said, one of the first things they did in the aftermath was create a jail out of the old Greyhound bus station. And what he said is in order for Reconstruction to happen, there must be law and order. And in order to have law and order, you have to have a jail. So you can't have in this conception, even in 2005, this idea that in order to rebuild the city, in order to seed something new, the very first thing you had to have was a jail. And to the point that you're making about, the conditions of prisons, like the conditions of that Greyhound, it's a bus station. It was, were horrendous. And so, yeah, I think that is, that's just, it rose to the top for me as you were saying that. And I'm like, we have not moved beyond.
That's right. And to Andrew's point about criminalization, the intensive media narrative almost immediately after the hurricane hit about looting and danger, violence, thugs, all this kind of racist nonsense that was very extreme, very immediate, literally meant that first responders were being pulled from necessary rescue missions in order to do this kind of law and order campaign that you're talking about. So, right, all of this becomes sort of self-perpetuating, right? That the narratives are attached to the institutions are reproducing these narratives from the beginning, right, of these moments.
Yeah. Thank you. So I would love, before we get into questions, in the questions that people have, we have time for a few, but I just want to this final question for the panel. I would love for y'all. Andrea mentioned this early in talking about abolition as both a vision and a practice. And so I would love for you all to talk about what abolitionist strategy, what abolitionist organizing looks like, and especially at intersections. Like, you all are all sort of looking at different intersections of oppression. And so I would love for y'all to talk about what is abolitionist strategy? Like, what does it mean to be an abolition organizing? What does that mean? Andrea, if you want to pop us off.
Sure. I mean, I think it means interrupting criminalization everywhere and every how that you can, right? Which is why our organization is called that. We were formed in the first iteration of this administration because we knew what I said, right? Which is that criminalization is not only how we create categories of others who are then to be, deemed as threats and eliminated, exterminated, but it's also how you manufacture consent for what's happening, because authoritarianism is something that takes more than just one man to do, right? It's something that takes a lot of people to do. And as long as we are participating in criminalization in some way or another, then we are aiding and abetting this process of authoritarianism and fascism right now. So it has to be at the core of our response. And we found interrupting criminalization to look at criminalization through the lens of women, queer, and trans people's experiences, because that's an intersection where you can see a lot more criminalization happening. It's not just police, prisons, ICE, and parole and probation. It's healthcare providers, and we're seeing criminalization of abortion, gender-affirming care. It's family policing, and we're seeing, parents being ripped from children, whether it's at the border and the kidnapping on the street or at the prison gate, right? It's benefits policing, like we're seeing with the MAGA murder bill that's moving through right now. It's about how we police who gets and who doesn't get benefits, happens very much at the intersection of gender, race, and sexuality, and so on. So we feel in this moment like we're powerless, but we actually have a great deal of power in our relationships and our conversations to interrupt criminalization. And when I think that's important to do, not just in certain settings, to not exceptionalize the violence of ICE without seeing the criminalization and the violence of what we would term regular law enforcement, right? Criminalization sort of normalizes a certain level of violence that all of us then think is kind of okay. And what we're seeing now is people being like, oh, but this level is not okay. None of it is okay. Not any of it is okay. And we can interrupt that criminalization in every conversation, in every interaction, in every group that we're part of. And you can just pick, right? If you want to interrupt criminalization of migrants, absolutely go out there and do that. And also recognize that part of that happens through criminalization of shoplifting, right? Under the Laken-Riley Act, if you're even accused of shoplifting by a cop, you're in mandatory ICE detention. And that's part of what they're kidnapping people on that basis. So fight in your community to decriminalize shoplifting, to decriminalize homelessness, to decriminalize drug use, to decriminalize, sure, abortion, you want to focus on that? Great. You should know that in Louisiana, they just deemed abortion medications controlled substances. So you need to be fighting the drug war if you want to stop the criminalization of abortion. And the same is true of T as gender affirming care. So I think that is the key part. And the last thing I'll say is that in interrupting criminalization, that means we can't participate in it. So we can't have our resistance focus on who is the real criminal and who's the person who's okay to send to El Salvador, or who should be locked up and who shouldn't. because that is being used against us in all the ways. And we can't be criminalizing our forms of resistance. We can't say it's okay if you lie down on the street to be stepped on by the horses, but it's not okay if you try and protect your neighbor from a violent abduction. In this moment, we need to be resisting everything that is advancing this regime that we are being, again, landed on. And we need to stop participating in the processes that make it possible. So I would just say abolitionist organizing is fighting criminalization wherever and however you see it happening. It's what got us here. It's what's keeping us here. And criminalization is definitely not going to get us out of here. And it's only by confronting and challenging criminalization that we have the best chance of striking at the heart of fascism and authoritarianism. Shut down your local ICE facility, shut down your local jail, shut down criminalization of healthcare, shut down the presence of ICE in your hospitals, shut down cops in schools. Just, it's everywhere. Find the piece that you feel moved to fight. Find people to fight it with. And what I would say we learn from incarcerated organizers is that collective action is the only way out, because they have total control over you when you're incarcerated. So the only power you have is with other people. Find other people and fight it wherever you can, however you can. That is abolitionist organizing against authoritarianism and fascism in this moment. Abolitionist organizers are the folks who have been doing it since Kenyon talked about it, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. Go find your local abolitionist organizers or your local groups that's fighting against criminalization. Get in, because we need you now.
Yeah, thank you. That's it. But I'll say this, that I think, one, I think it is about thinking about the totality of how this system functions, and obviously, absolutely including the actual cages, prisons, jails, detention centers, etc., but also the other places through which it shows up, right? And no matter what kind of organizing or what kind of work you do, always kind of keeping that abolitionist perspective. So for, example, for the last, roughly 10, 15 years, I've been working mostly in public health around, HIV stuff or whatever. And one, just been involved in some of the work around kind of decriminalizing, HIV non-disclosure, laws or exposure laws, but also challenging a lot of people in that space, which, 10 years ago, people were not so happy to see me coming when I said that some of these efforts at reforming state laws, where you would reduce the sort of criminal penalties for non-disclosure, but then you let the state legislature then include other infectious diseases in the criminal code that didn't exist before. And I took the position that this is like an unethical policy stance, and we can't do it. And we should be actually just calling for repeal of these laws as much as possible, more than just, either kind of tweaking them around the edges or making, what we know is viral suppression, which is, people who are generally on their, antiretroviral medication for HIV, then are, not detectable and also can't transmit the virus, not making the laws dependent on that, because we know who has access to healthcare in this country and who doesn't. That's still ultimately a very racialized system of making those distinctions. So I think fighting those things wherever you are, and certainly as Dan's point around COVID, I wrote a piece a few years ago about that particular issue, and that throughout the height of the COVID pandemic in the United States, the counties that had the highest COVID rates were where the prisons are. And it was because of what was happening in the prisons. And I was making the argument that this isn't an aberration or kind of an accident. It's actually baked into the logic of incarceration and the prison system, that you are going to be subjected to ill health should you come into this system, right? That is actually part of the function of it, and not just, oops, this is what happened. So I think those things. The last couple of things I'll say is, I think culture is really important. I love that, all of us here, we write, we organize, and, we're, big eggheads on issues. But I also think that, developing, I think about the ways in which a lot of people the things that kind of open up when people experience things through culture, right? That can really shift how people see a thing. I think about we're talking about kind of the abolitionist in the kind of early period post-slavery. Like I often think about what Angela Davis wrote about in Blues Legacies and Black Feminism, the way in which like blues as an art form is so indicative of like a particular conversation around Black freedom, because so much of early blues was about travel, right? Being able to go wherever the hell you wanted to, when you want to, and also being able to love and partner with or have sex with whomever you wanted to, right? Outside of control from the state, a plantation owner, whatever the case may be. And that's also why there's so much queerness in the early blues music, right? Because it was about like a freedom to actually express oneself outside of whatever kind of social norms in that sense. And so I think, I could think of other ways in which culture has kind of also helped kind of, move the needle. I think about Bob Marley, Concrete Jungle, as an abolitionist song. No chains around my feet, but I'm not free. I know I'm bound here in captivity, right? Like that's the whole, is there life for me outside of this concrete jungle? That's a jail, right? Like Kingston, Trenchtown is a jail, right? Is what he's describing. And so, I think we have to do that work. And the last thing I'll say is another lesson, I think, particularly from people who are locked up behind bars, that I don't think we also talk enough about, because the system likes to paint people as aberrant and as like subhuman, is that the amount of care that people often express in those conditions and take care of one another in very particular kinds of ways. And obviously the institutions help create ways in which people also commit acts of violence. I'm not taking anything out of that systems. There are also examples of ways in which people take great care of one another despite those conditions.
Yeah, I really, really just want to echo and underscore what Kenny and Andrea have both been saying. I think that sense of all of us or none is a foundational abolitionist principle, right? That no one is disposable, that right, this time it's going to be all of us, that no one gets left behind. And I think we're all, those of us that work in and around the prison context in particular, are very familiar with the ways that even reform or organizations, people who care about mass incarceration have tended to cut people out, right? So only certain people are eligible to be resentenced when a law changes, or only certain people will be deemed worth fighting for, et cetera. And the abolitionist argument has always been, right, fighting for everybody, right? And in particular, as we're seeing this awful imposition of austerity backed by armed state force, right? Both it's that sense of like we need everyone, and that we're fighting like everything for everyone, right? that we're fighting for the good life for all of us, inside and outside these facilities. And so that the bad news is that the carceral state is everywhere, right? As Andrea and Kenan were laying out. The good news of that means that you can fight it everywhere, right? And so I think we have to really recognize these fights over healthcare access are abolitionist fights, right? These fights over, job guarantees and unionization are abolitionist fights, or at least should be seen as them, right? When all of these cuts that this bill is going to force upon federal government, but also state and local governments come into place, all that's backed up by increased funding for the policing apparatus, which is going to mean a lot of dead people, right? Some of them who are killed very immediately, some of them who are killed very slowly in these prisons, jails, and detention centers. And so, we have to really recognize that all of these fights are fights against the carceral state, but I think we have to make them that, right? We have to make sure that we're not severing, right, these fights for reproductive justice from fights against criminalization, et cetera. That also means, I think, that we need a lot of people doing a lot of different things, right? That we need a proliferation of tactics and strategies. And so I just want to say for folks who are listening to this or watching this, right, that I think you're hearing all of us say, we need everyone doing everything. And I think that's true, but I want to say that not everyone can do everything, right? And so I think part of the abolitionist strategy is also like how do we create a movement ecosystem, right? And recognizing that some people are going to be pursuing different tactics than others, but it is part of the same struggle and part of the same fight. And I think the fight against Cop City in Atlanta has been such a breath of fresh air around this approach, so that you have people who have been doing ballot initiatives and you have people who are doing forest occupations on the land where the state is trying to build Cop City, and everything in between, right? And a real recognition, per Kenyon's point, which I so deeply appreciate, that we have to love and protect each other along the way, right? And so people might be doing different strategies, but how can we ensure that those strategies are in pursuit of a common goal, right? They might be across different organizations or even different coalitions. They're going to be in different places, right? But they have to be working in pursuit of a sort of common objective. We spend too much time fighting with people, you know, to our left or maybe immediately to our right, and not enough time focusing on the actual dangers and the actual holders of power. And so these kinds of tactical or strategic differences are where sometimes people break down unnecessarily. So I think it's really important that we cultivate this kind of healthy movement ecosystem approach. And that even if we're pursuing different tactics or strategies, that sense of care and camaraderie and solidarity is the animating purpose, right? And I think behind any movement worth its salt, you see that profound expressions of care. And that's, you know, inside jails, prisons, and detention centers are where we see that most extremely, because we're where we can see people suffering the most extreme structural form of deprivation in this country. But it's also, right, when your friend or your neighbor or your lover or your partner or your kid gets picked up, like, do you have, like, are you supporting them? Is your community supporting them? Like, these sort of basic mechanisms, or even if, you know, prisoner support is not your sort of main issue, so to speak, we all have to do it, because it's all, as James Baldwin so beautifully said in his open letter to Angela Davis after she was arrested in 1970, right? If they're coming for you that morning, they'll be coming for us that evening. So that sense of care is our strategy, right? It is our values, it is our purpose, it is our politic.
Thank y'all so much. I'm always so fed by all of you individually. So I'm really grateful to be here. I want to encourage everyone who is joining us, who is watching live and who is watching after the broadcast, the recording of the broadcast, to follow these brilliant people on social media. Kenya's TikTok. Get into it. Get into it. We will absolutely be sending y'all links. We'll be sending y'all readings. We'll be sending you videos for you to get into and for you to engage with after this call. But what I really want to lift up here is that hopefully what you heard from each of our speakers today is this question of vision in the world that we're envisioning, in a world where we are interacting and interdependent in a new way, where we take care of each other in a new way, so that we can really look at and address what are the root causes of, you know, what we call crime in this country, what is causing that, and also to look at the roots of this country and the ways in which prisons, incarceration, criminalization are at the roots of that, and how do we dig up those roots? And also, how do we develop strategies that keep our eyes on the vision of the world that we want to see? And that's a lot of what we're inviting you all into with this weekend, with this sort of Free America framework. Is like, what is the vision of freedom that inspires us, that builds us? One of the things that the right has done is make America great again as a vision, y'all. Mm-hmm. And they have been able to organize themselves around that vision and to build strategy toward that vision. And we have to be doing the same. And so how do we think about what our vision is for the world we want to see and how we can build towards that vision? So I want to thank you all. I know we didn't get to the questions. I love y'all. We're going to try to, I hope you heard some of the answers in the responses. We're going to send y'all some things to get into, some text to get into. Also, all of these people they write things that you should read because they are big thinkers, and their analysis is so sharp. So you should definitely get into some of those things. One of the things I just want to leave you all with, the last thing I will say before I pass it back to Risa to kind of do our final close, is that one of the quotes that I learned very early in critical resistance as a teenage baby organizer, is one of the things that I keep my brain on as I am organizing and as I'm thinking about the vision for the world, to remind me that none of this is permanent, that we can change our conditions, is a quote from Assata Shakur. She says, "A wall is just a wall and nothing more at all. It can't be broken down." And so I want to invite you all into thinking about the conditions that we're in right now as temporary. We can change them. We can build something new. And that is the invitation to all of you. So thank you again, Kenyon. Thank you again, Andrea. Thank you again, Dan. I am always deeply in awe. And with that, I will pass it back to Risa.
All right. Thank you all so much. It has been a pleasure to be here listening to such incredible speakers and thinkers. Thank you all for joining us here live on YouTube and on Facebook, and for everybody who watches this after. Make sure you check your email if you registered for tonight's chat. Links will be sent to all of the registrants. Also, make sure that you are checking our link tree for what we're up to and what you can do to plug in. This weekend is our Free America weekend, and this July 4th, while the U.S. marks Independence Day, we'll gather across the country on porches, in town squares, backyards, and streets to stand for real freedom and build a vision of a free America brick by brick. Free America is wherever we are, and free America is whatever we make it. So this is your invitation to take it back. Look for the calendar and toolkit to be sent out soon. It's in our link tree, so you can join us by finding an event on the map near you. You can also host your own event. So make sure you check our link tree to see all the ways that you can plug in for this Free America weekend. Again, we'll be sending out all the links from tonight via email, so watch your emails for that. And thank you again for joining us tonight.